So welcome, everyone. We know we stand between, lunch is following and we're already a bit late, which is partly why we'll have a 45-minute session, so that's good news. It's not 1 hour. And the other reason is, you see, we are 3 of us, and that's actually a good number, so we can have really an interactive discussion. Now, you may have been surprised, the topic, sanctions, trade sanctions, and we will focus on sanctions and not export controls. Why? And the purpose of the session is really kind of to raise awareness of the relevance and importance of international trade sanctions also in India, already now, but in particular then also going forward. That's certainly our view from a global perspective, and I will take the opportunity also that we are now 3 of us, and with Gaurav and Rupesh then chiming in. They were introduced, and I'm very happy to have them on board, because they definitely will tell you that it is already relevant for them, because their companies being multinationals, being exposed to international sanctions, but then being based here in India, they do have to deal with sanctions in place. Now, having said that, I know, and I've had discussions this week already, or I'm having discussions, the perception, this is something of the West, and this is not really so relevant here. I would like to already kick off with what I actually had kept for the end. For the US, certainly, and in particular, the Attorney General not long ago said sanctions, that's the new FCPA. Now, you know what happened with FCPA in India, so that is why we are certain that sanctions will become more relevant in India as well, because it is relevant, will be more relevant, and stay relevant globally, and certainly in the US. We have to touch on Russia just by example. Again, we know that, and I also understand, so I have an Indian background myself. I'm based in Zurich, but I come here regularly. And I do also advise Indian companies on global sanctions, namely Indian multinationals who are exposed to sanctions. I do need to mention Russia, not because of relevance or not from an Indian perspective. There is. So we all know about India's stance. We're not talking about politics today, but about really the rules. But it is relevant to understand and set the stage, which is now what I'm going to do, given we're the 3 of us. And then the idea is then for Rupesh and Gaurav to tell you how that impacts, or what regulations they have to deal with already now. And ultimately, most importantly for you here, also working in companies, how they deal with in terms of instilling trade compliance, sanctions compliance in their businesses. So the global framework, that is what I am practicing day in, day out for years. We do across the globe. Yes, of course, it is an instrument primarily of the West, but let us not forget, and India is a UN member, and that's where I keep saying we have a lot in common, Switzerland and India. We are also a UN member, and that's it. So as a starting point, also Switzerland, we only are legally bound to apply UN sanctions. That's it. The same for India. But India, as you may know, and certainly my colleagues here know, has imposed some very selective unilateral sanctions against certain countries on the basis of UN sanctions. And then, of course, we don't only have the US, we have UK, EU, and EU has sanctions over years. Many of you are also kind of exposed to. And Switzerland, being where we are in the middle of Europe by now, we more often than not, we implement EU sanctions, but we don't have to, but we do. And the same is actually true for Russia. So I mentioned UK, so maybe as one starting point, not only here, again, also in Switzerland, all over the world, it was always all these years, yeah, the US, the US, the US. It's only about we're scared of US sanctions, and there's good reasons for that because of the concept of US sanctions. You were exposed to US sanctions in particular because of this very far-reaching US person concept that can catch you all over the world. Most companies have US people, so US persons in their groups. And because of the so-called secondary sanctions, which even apply to non-US persons. But then, and UK will be quite relevant, I would assume, for many Indian companies, given traditional relations. Lots of Indian companies have or would have a presence in the UK. UK, since Brexit, no longer EU, they have their own set of rules. And very soon after Brexit, they issue new foreign trade policy, export controls, and in particular sanctions that are similar to the, or started off similarly to the EU, but by now they are a separate set of rules, one, and actually conceptually are by now more akin to US sanctions in many ways. So you have to look at US sanctions, you have to look at UK sanctions, and UK sanctions again, as soon as you are a UK citizen, and I would assume many are these dual citizens or have UK touch points, again, UK sanctions would apply sooner than you may expect. And then EU sanctions, again, if you're an EU citizen, EU sanctions apply. So it's not just about UK territorially or EU territorially, it's really also personally, which again brings it closer to the US concept of sanctions. So that's about when these sanctions apply. And on the example of Russia, and with that I will kind of then hand over on how my colleagues are confronted with it now. This is about when sanctions apply. Now, what do trade sanctions mean? We all know, understand trade sanctions is a tool that has been developed decades ago. We have UN sanctions, but then in particular US sanctions, so unilateral sanctions or regional sanctions imposed by the EU. They are a foreign policy and a foreign trade policy tool to discipline typically a country for various reasons, typically war. But nowadays, and that's a complete new set of sanctions, it's not the traditional, okay, it's against the country where you have certain types of sanctions, but more and more also what we call thematical or topical sanctions by subject, so human rights violations, any types of violations of international law, which will trigger sanctions on the basis of a certain conduct, which still may directly or indirectly be targeted against the country, but it can be much more far-reaching. And in terms of the tools, and we call it a toolkit, what Russia has shown us is two things. One, going back to the countries, there is a leveling up. So we have unprecedented sanctions at a much higher level than ever before, and in particular, it's no longer only the US, it is the G7. So the G7 has by now regularly rolled out, or at least decided politically, okay, this is going to be the next wave of sanctions, we call them sanctions packages, that we as G7 will impose, but it's still, the US will do something, the UK will do something, the EU will do something. Let's not forget Canada is also kind of on the rise. And unfortunately for companies, it's not yet, it's coordinated in terms of timing to some extent on concept and purpose, but it's still not the same sanctions because concepts are still the same. You're used to US, UK new and EU, so you have lots of differences still. And in particular, which was a big surprise for US companies in relation to Russia, some sanctions are stricter in Europe than in the US. So we suddenly had companies realizing, oh, we can do that under US sanctions, but we can't do it under EU sanctions. So that is one. And in terms of tools, traditionally, we have what we call the restricted parties. So who can you not do business with? SDNs or designated partners, DPs, how we call them. That's there. That's kind of the basic tool set. You have products which includes technology that you cannot, so that's product-related controls, what can I not sell, export, and so on. That's also tradition, so that was all in there. What Russia brought about, more and more, you already had it, is sectors. You target sectors. And in particular, most important, that's of course where India came in terms of, that's the energy sector. So you always look in sanctions of what would typically affect the targeted country most. So you have lots of different sectoral bans, you have investment bans, you have something which affects all of us under the Russia sanctions, legal services bans, all types of services banned. That was a novelty. And so you have many tools that were created, invented politically, and all the authorities had to implement them. And even the authorities at the beginning didn't really understand, okay, what are we supposed to do with this now, let alone the companies. So this is all novel that companies have to deal with around the world. And that is why Russia became so relevant. It's at a high level. It's different tools, known and unknown, at a high intensity, and it keeps regularly changing. We have hundreds to thousands of designated parties, and we have concepts which don't only look at the lists of designated parties, but at least in Europe, it's also about who owns these companies, who controls these companies. They're also considered designated or sanctioned. So that is why this has gotten sanctions to a next level, and we'll get to what does that mean for the future later on. But with that now, I'd really like to first hand over to Gaurav, what it means in terms of what you and his company, Bentley, have to deal with in terms of regulations now and today, and then we'll talk about business, impact on businesses, on Indian businesses of existing sanctions.
Yeah, thanks, Phillips. Just wanted to give a brief introduction of what our company does. So we are basically a US-based company having our offices spread globally around 45 to 50 countries. We have been present in India since 2000, almost 23 odd years. Typically from a compliance perspective, we are required to comply with certain US regulations when it typically comes to export. That is export from the US to rest of the world. Now, typically exports would include exports of the softwares physically, that is through a CD or dongles. It could also be by way of, updates, upgrades, issuing security patches, maintenance support, professional services. It could be export for products as well as export for services. Now, insofar as these issues are concerned, whether it's the export of product or services, we are governed by certain US legislations. And these typically include the US Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets, which is also known as OFAC, and these sanctions apply to Bentley as a company. OFAC typically administers and enforces economic trade sanctions on various legal authorities, and they maintain a list of individuals, entities, and countries which are subject to sanctions. And it also periodically issues regulations and directions in these in this regard. Another regime which talks about the compliance with the US export control laws are what we call as export administration regulations, popularly known as EAR, and the International Tariff in Arms Regulations, that is ITAR. And these regulations regulate the export of goods, technologies, as well as services that have national security implications. And they can also have provisions related to sanctions. Now, when it comes to Bentley, we would be implementing these regulations regardless of where the products are located, where they are sold, and regardless of who's using them. Now, when we are dealing with Bentley India as an entity, we have Indian customers, and as a general protocol, as a general principle, we are required to ensure that there are certain categories of clients or customers who would typically come within the scrutiny of the US export control legislations. So we have sufficient safeguards and clauses in our end user license agreement to kind of ensure that these customers and clients do comply with the requirements. So there are certain categories of employees, like companies which are arranged in military services, nuclear programs, etc. So they do not automatically get the right to use of product. They are subject to certain, certain sort of scrutiny at the US level, where we typically follow KYC norms for these certain sectoral specific entities, where we have to submit, where the users have to submit the form, furnish the information about the nature of activities they are doing, and once that information is processed, our US compliance team would interact with the subject matter expert law firms to ascertain whether whatever is the end use of the product or services that is in compliance with the US export control regulations. And based on that, either there would be no requirement of a license, or there could be requirement of licenses with certain terms and conditions which need to be complied with by the user of these products. So we kind of adhere to these norms very strictly. Most of our agreements, proposals, quotes have these specific provisions dealing with the compliance of the US export control regulations. And the reason is why. Why are we so kind of rigid about this? Because one of the reasons is that under the US export control laws, the penalties for non-compliances are really high. There could be imprisonments, there could be severe fines per breach, and also there could be a debarment of these companies from exporting the products. So from a individual company's perspective, the stakes are quite high. So that's why we try to ensure full compliance in terms of the regulatory requirements, and also in terms of the contractual and legal framework.
Thanks a lot. Gaurav, Rupesh, how is it on your side now in terms of the regulatory framework you have to deal with in your work with your company? Maybe first.
So, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I know we are the three people who are coming between you and lunch. So, I'll try to keep it very crisp on this topic around my experience on this relevant subject. Why I call it relevant? Because as of now, we are not understanding much on the impact of these regulations on our business, because we feel that we are immune from those sanctions which are being put on. But trust me, as sanctions were not heard of much earlier. We came to know as professionals, we came to know as legal professionals, we came to know about sanctions only when this Russia-Ukraine war happened. Sanctions, as Phil rightly said, he's an authority on the subject, and he can talk, endlessly on it. So as he said, sanctions has been there since more than last 20 years. So it since in 2014, when Russia did the same thing with Crimea, first sanctions kicked in. But this time it was more forceful, because the way events unfolded, it was really unprecedented, so to say. So I'll just sorry again, I'm using some cheat notes. It's been 3 years of talking, on offline, so you have some cheat notes ready. So I'll taking those up again. So what I want to say is that as businesses, we need to be more nimble and agile about what's happening around the world, because today our businesses is not something which is only inside. It's more outside in. We are dependent upon a lot of international supply chains. Our businesses get impacted. A very small incident happens outside, we get impacted. Honestly, till Ukraine happened, I was not aware how many of our doctors are studying in Ukraine and they had to come back. I was not aware that, the wheat supplies, a lot of wheat supplies come in from Ukraine. I was not aware that palladium, which Ukraine has a source which is used in for our auto industry, or for that semiconductor industry that is used there. So these sanctions, typically, sanctions which are used more as a tool of power, because when we say it comes from US, it's not that only US is putting sanctions. After United Nations, Russia, China, everyone has come with its own set of sanctions. So things become extremely complex, and as of now, we are not realizing it much. We were having a discussion, so to say. I think Phil will talk about this later. But let's say that China invades Taiwan in the same manner Russia has done with Ukraine. So the impact would be felt much higher. So as a company, as a US company, our parent company is a US company, and I'm sure that a lot of my colleagues sitting here would have some parentage outside, maybe in US or UK or EU, or maybe some aligned countries like Japan. So as a US company, we have no option but to comply with these sanction regime, which essentially means, as Gaurav was also talking about, then incorporating some clauses in the agreements with our partners, with our distributors of our products, that to ensure that they don't deal with those sanctioned individual and entities, so to say, and they keep a proper record of where they are selling their goods and where they are providing their services. And it comes more relevant in terms when you are doing exports, is when you're not much aware. So that's a very tricky piece, and then a lot of screening happens through some softwares to identify that are there any red flags, and we need to do some kind of additional due diligence in those processes. Are some of the ways it happens. A lot of time, we keep getting that kind of pushback from our customers that they are not ready to disclose use, and sometimes it comes at the cost of doing business as well. So that's where professionals like us need to support business to sensitize them that why is this requirement and what we can do around these kind of issues, and also to reach out to like-minded people in the other side to inform that why these requirements are there. It's ideally not poking into what they are trying to do with the products or technologies or services they are availing. It's more to do with compliances, so that we can be in the larger interest, larger global interest for which these sanctions have been put in place. These objectives can be met. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say. Over to you.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Rupesh. So you mentioned already exposure relevance, how it suddenly came up, and just to give two examples now specifically, one is from the Western perspective and one is from, I believe, from an Indian perspective. So in terms of our advising our companies or clients, so of course often for the known reasons, transactions within a group, of course, may be channeled out of China, out of India. And then, now purely from a Western perspective, you can do that for as long, basically you have to cut out any link to anyone in the US, in UK, in the EU, wherever else sanctions are in place, which would mean the group company would be completely standalone, because otherwise, indeed, it would be not only subject to, but potentially fall foul of Western sanctions. So that's number one, where Indian companies come in. The second point is, and it was mentioned today, is the big mantra that we're also advocating now from a business perspective, China plus one. Now, China plus one has also an angle. What does it mean? And now we're talking about supply chain. If India becomes and wants to become what China has been, it will automatically also be directly exposed to sanctions in terms of the sooner or as soon as you become part of the supply chain, your counterparties will, both upstream, downstream, they already do now, make sure and have to ensure that you in India are compliant because it's a chain reaction. You have to, throughout the chain, from a Western perspective, demonstrate that you know who you're dealing with, where your products go, and who will be the end user and what will be the end use. So it has, of course, the impact, the positive business impact, but also it's another reason why sanctions will more and more impact the businesses. And the third is, of course, about China. It is, of course, a lot about, I mentioned energy, it's about critical sectors, critical raw materials, rare materials. India is equally dependent from China, from other countries. You mentioned Ukraine. Yes, indeed, Ukraine has a lot, which many in the world were not aware of, the dependence on countries like this. So it is highly relevant, and we don't even want to speak about Taiwan. And then we get about microchips, semiconductors, where there are already sanctions and export controls, again, from the US. So it's already there, and that's what we've been saying. Russia has been happening. It's tragic enough. But everything else, it's already there, and it's just waiting to become more critical. So with that in mind, turning now into how do you instill or apply sanctions compliance, or what you said, going back to you, Gaurav, first, in your businesses, with your businesses, in your role, legal compliance, to ensure that the business is done how it is expected to be done here in India and out of India?
Yeah, so thanks, Philip. I think before going into the processes, I wanted to kind of bring out certain challenges which we as a legal counsels face both internally and externally. So, I mean, when I joined Bentley way back around 12 years ago, so I was given this training on export control requirement, and I kind of understood the context. But internally, it's you have to kind of ensure that all the stakeholders, whether they are from sales, procurement, etc., they pretty much know about. They're aware of the requirements of having these, implications of non-compliance with the sanctions. So we always need to periodically train them on the export control regulations. There are annual trainings which happen internally across the board for all the colleagues. And this is a continuous process. It's not a one-time process. We kind of ensure that all the right processes and procedures are followed, and so that's how we try to handle the situation internally. Practically speaking, when we are negotiating the contracts with the customers, especially the Indian customers, we have to explain to them as to why we need to have these provisions in our agreement, because at times you've seen that they try to push back to delete these clauses, saying that you are an Indian company, we are an Indian company, why are we required to follow the US obligations? So we need to explain to them what are the implications, why it's required. And I think eventually they do understand, but there is a lot of pushback, from them initially. Now, when it comes to certain categories of countries, and certain categories of transactions I mentioned, say for example, any software or services which have to be used, say for nuclear facilities or nuclear purposes, those are the ones which are kind of under scrutiny from a US law perspective. But considering the relationship in India and the US, normally these transactions, subject to certain license requirements, do get they do kind of get approved. Other than that, in addition to direct transactions, we also have to be careful to have clauses ensuring that whenever the products have been sold to the customers in India, and if they want to further re-export those products outside India, or they want to transfer the licenses, those licenses are not transferred to the jurisdictions which are embargoed by the US laws. So that's why any subsequent license transfer is subject to the approval from our operations team, and we do not fully or allow the transfer of licenses outside India without following the export control requirements. So our operations teams are kind of handled to ensure that whenever there are any requests for license transfer or assignment, they follow the due process. They ensure that, if there is a requirement to have a separate request for, doing the diligence to ascertain the purpose of the products, that requirement is complied with and all the relevant documentations, etc. are followed. Only once that is done, then only, the products are assigned or reassigned or transferred outside the country. As I said, this is a continuous compliance regime which has to happen, over a period of time, and it's not like a one-time effort. Thanks.
Thanks, Gaurav. That sounds already quite comprehensive and cumbersome. Maybe come to the enforcement or the consequences in a moment. But again, Rupesh, your experience now, practically speaking.
So I think, as my friend Gaurav, rightly said, training is one thing, which is an aspect companies should do more often. It helps to sensitize, the sales teams, the operations teams, the importance of these kind of sanctions. Additionally, what I would suggest businesses and my fellow professionals in this this domain is that we should analyze the impact of these kind of sanctions on our business, as we were discussing earlier. Additionally, what I would suggest is make these global sanctions as an integral part of the risk management process of their companies and part of their business continuity plans. Phil did talk about China plus one as a strategy, and that's something which we regularly advise our businesses not to keep your eggs in one basket, not to be dependent upon one particular country, one particular territory alone. So need to do something, and at the same time, investing in research and development, which as an Indian companies we see lot. We are not doing less. Yes, the Indian government has recently announced that research and development, some new initiative they have done. But apart from that, as companies and Indian businesses, we need to invest more in research and development to be more self-dependent, to be, so to say, in terms of technologies. And yes, at the end, employ professionals like us to advise businesses on how to navigate through this complex web of sanction regimes. Thank you so much. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Rupesh. I hinted at enforcement. So we heard Gaurav in particular about the consequences of violations now of US sanctions in particular. That has been out there too. We talk about multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. Yes, there have been certain sectors, finance sector for sure, energy sector, and we are yet to see, it's already started, Russia sanctions enforcement, even in Switzerland, and typically it's about dealings with sanctioned parties and around products that end up, the wrong products ending up, now specifically speaking, in Russia. So it of course starts again because these low-hanging fruits, there's a lot of experience, persons you're supposed to identify, and you see it on the battlefield, you see the goods on the battlefield, and goods have to be exported. So customs nowadays in the West, customs authorities implement and enforce sanctions so it doesn't get out of the country. And you have more and more authorities now turning to circumvention, diversion. So there's the next step. Of course, one is direct, the other one indirect. You realize, of course, that countries are being used, allies, around, and they don't need to be around the country. That's the obvious ones. But wherever a country either does not follow or even has a policy where those imposing sanctions believe, well, this might be a country where products might be channeled through. So nowadays authorities will ask the companies in the West, and there's intelligence nowadays, of course. Secret services are involved anyway. nowadays about, well, we've seen, so the company will get letter, we've seen your products ending, well, in a country, say Kazakhstan, to take an obvious example, with a dealer there who is promoting your products, and there is intelligence that these products end up, because there's business with Russia. Please explain, do you know about where your products go? This is happening now. It's also happening in Switzerland, by the way. And so that's one element. And then, of course, again, looking at the consequences, UK has introduced strict liability. So it's just you violate and you're in principle liable. Whereas before we did have concepts of, and would have, well, first you have to prove it's about gravity, it's about negligence. So we're moving more and more into more, well, per se violations, presumption, and in particular strict liability. So I think that's something also Gaurav wanted to hint at in terms of the risks for the companies already there, and that's certainly what we see coming more and more. And that maybe leads us, in the interest of time, and also giving you an opportunity to chime in. What do we see? Now we see, partly already mentioned, stricter enforcement. Sanctions they're here to stay. There are certain sanctions with some small countries that have even been abolished. Now I'm speaking for Europe. Most regimes you have seen over the years, they've once been imposed, they stayed. They've gone up, down, maybe. We've had Syria, Libya, Myanmar, went down a bit, went up again. Iran, I mean, that's the classic example. That was the one before Russia. Depends on the nuclear deal. So that has always been at a high level, more likely going up again. And again, China around the corner, already sanctions in place in the US, in Europe, in the UK. Export controls and other elements and tools that we are not touching upon now, but all have strategic and trade policy rationales behind. So there's also kind of a mix of tools which the Indian government very much also uses. I think Rupesh was hinting at it. You will see legislation coming in which will have at least similar impacts and effects of where can I, from a pure perspective of I don't want my goods end up somewhere I don't want to. I'm dependent on certain goods from some countries, so we need to balance. But there are different tools now beyond sanctions, but with a similar impact. So they're going to stay. They're going to be staying at a high level, and there will be always countries which will cause other countries to impose sanctions, and there is China. So maybe 1-2 remarks from you, and please think about, if not already, questions, comments from the audience, sharing your experience. How do you see this pan out from an Indian perspective? But please, maybe again, first Gaurav, then Rupesh, before we close.
Yeah, I think Philips has kind of highlighted most of the risks which do come with this sanction regime. These would range from inability of the companies to be able to access certain technologies, do business with proper banking channels, because banks might impose a huge cost on diligence, etc. So, I mean, if you are in a sanction regime, it's not going to be easy for the Indian companies to do business. They have to kind of comply with a lot of requirements. So I think when we are dealing with the companies or countries which are under the sanction regime, one has to be very careful, so that I think things are only going to get more difficult from here. Now, with the advance of technology, there are softwares, as Philip said, where you can easily identify whether a particular product, individual, or country comes within a sanction regimes. And with the advance in technology and use of cryptocurrency and blockchains, the person against whom the sanctions are imposed are in a way able to circumvent those barriers. So I think the rules and regulations are only going to become stricter from here going forward. And as Phil said that, FCPAs, now the sanctions will be the new FCPAs, because we know how FCPA regime has kind of impacted globally the anti-corruption culture in many companies across the globe. So I think we'll have to ensure that from a compliance perspective and even from a sanction regime perspective, we have strict checks and balances in place. Companies periodically update their policies, check what are the checks and balances in place, and also ensure that there is a proper use of technology to ensure compliance with these kind of regimes. Thanks.
In the interest of time, a very quick point, Phil did talk about being questioned by regulators on why they are doing this, and Gaurav covered, I think, in detail. There could be penalties in terms of millions of dollars. So what I want to, what again I would say what we are not taking seriously enough is that there have been instances where when people don't comply, they come in the list of those sanctioned designated nationals, SDNs, as Phil said. And recently, I think a couple of months back, one of the trading entity in India who was doing, bypassing these regulations was put in that list because they were trading that Iranian oil and selling it to some other countries which they were not allowed to. So with that, I'll hand it over for his final comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rupesh. Any questions, comments from the floor, from the audience? Yeah, please. I mentioned initially. So one, India as a UN member does India have sanctions? So India as a UN member is bound by UN sanctions in principle, and they are implemented by the Indian authorities with even some. That's not unilateral because they all target countries that are subject to UN sanctions, like Iraq. There are special measures that then are imposed by the Indian government with respect to certain countries, but there are no, as of now, unilateral sanctions beyond or with countries that are not already subject to UN sanctions.
Just a minute. So, sorry. So one thing just I wanted to add. So as I said, it's an expression of power. So India doesn't have that influence over the global trade. We are just 2% of that global trade. But we do have something called SCOMET. SCOMET list is there, where certain kind of, technologies or products, it is being controlled by Director General of Foreign Trade. They are prohibited to be sending, as Phil said, to United Nations. So there is a special chemicals, organisms and technologies, largely, those dual-use technologies which are prohibited to be sent out from India. And or I would say they are regulated and needs to go through some kind of government screening process before you can do that.
Any other question? If not, thanks for your interest. We had a steady number of people, actually even slightly increasing number of people from the beginning, which very happy no one left. Even better, now you will be allowed to leave, but I'll hand over to you. Thanks a lot for your interest. And any questions, please reach out to us during one of the breaks. Thanks.
And you have been a very lovely audience on this very boring subject, I would say, upcoming subjects. Thank you. Thank you a lot.